Welcome to the Church of God Jesus Witnesses. Today I would like to share the Word of God to help us understand the name and structure of the 7 annual feasts. But first let's summarize the 7 feasts as seen in the image to help us understand the name of each feast and how they were celebrated. Even though there are 7 feasts, the 7 feasts are organized 3 times per year. The first is the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The second are the Feast of Firstfruits and the Feast of Weeks. The third is the Feast of Trumpet, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Although there are 7 feasts, the Israelites went up to Jerusalem 3 times a year to keep the feasts. They went up to the temple in Jerusalem once to keep the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Firstfruits and the Feast of Weeks, to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Trumpet, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's now turn to Exodus chapter 23 verse 14 through 16 to further understand how the feasts are to be celebrated. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the Feast of Harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Celebrate the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your crops from the field. In Exodus chapter 34 verse 22 and 23 it says to celebrate the Feast of Weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the turn of the year. 3 times a year all your men are to appear before the Sovereign Lord, the God of Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 16 we can see once again that the Lord said 3 times a year all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Tabernacles. No man should appear before the Lord empty-handed. As we have learned there are 7 annual appointed feasts, so why did God say you should go to the temple only 3 times a year? Even until Jesus' coming, the Jews continued this tradition. To know the meaning of such a Jewish tradition, we need to take a closer look at the system of God's law. We must first understand that the sanctuary, the sacrifices, and the feasts are one law. To keep the feast, the Israelites had to travel to Jerusalem, where the temple was. Traveling to Jerusalem with relatives to keep the feasts was expensive and time-consuming. When the Israelites went to Jerusalem to keep the feast, they stayed in Jerusalem to keep more than one feast. For instance, they stood in Jerusalem from the Feast of Trumpet to the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. They had to stay in Jerusalem for a considerable period of time to celebrate the feast. It was a completely different situation than our attending a church nearby today. In other words, it was difficult for the Israelites to go to Jerusalem 3 times to keep the Feast of the Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Therefore, by celebrating these 3 feasts together it became less expensive and time-consuming. It was also customary to call all of the feasts to be observed at once as a representative feast name. For example, when they went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread they said, "We are going to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread." When they went to celebrate the feast a 3rd time for the Feast of Trumpet, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, they just said, "We are going to observe the Feast of Tabernacles." As previously mentioned, the Israelites were to appear to the Lord at the place he chose 3 times a year to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. This was a custom the Israelites had to follow even in the age of the New Testament. Let's take a look at another verse to see how the feasts are celebrated in the New Testament by turning to Luke chapter 2 verse 41 through 43. We can see that every year Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival, according to the custom. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. It is clear that the men of Israel went to the temple in Jerusalem to keep the feast as adults when they turned 12 years old. The expression, "when they had fulfilled the days," shows that they stayed in Jerusalem for the entire duration of the feasts. In Matthew chapter 26 verse 17 we can also see that on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" As previously mentioned and according to the sacred calendar, the Passover is the 14th day of the first month, which was called the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The point is that the entire period, including the Passover, was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Other examples of how the Passover was also called the Feast of Unleavened Bread can be found in other parts of the Bible. We can also see in another verse by turning to Mark chapter 14 verse 12 that on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" In Luke chapter 22 verse 1 and 7 it says, "Now the festival of unleavened bread called the Passover was approaching. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." Likewise, when calling the third-time feasts, it was a common use to call the Feast of Tabernacles as a representative name. There is a record in John 7 that Jesus went up to Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles. According to the record in John 7, Jesus stayed in Jerusalem for a long period, which was called the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's take a look at a few more verses in John chapter 7. But when the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near after his brothers had left for the feast, he went also. Now at the feast, the Jews were watching for him and asking, "Where is that man?" Not until halfway through the feast did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. On the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink." As we have seen throughout this study, there are 7 annual feasts, but the Israelites had to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. We also call the annual feasts the 7 feasts of 3 time. We hope you enjoyed this study. God bless you and bye for now from the Church of God Jesus Witnesses.